Socialism and Slavery. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. Sometimes in these podcasts, I save the answer for the end. This time the answer comes right away in one sentence. What is the commonality between socialism and slavery? The answer is, others do your work. That's it. Now, you're welcome to stay for 12 to 15 minutes while I develop this, but that's the answer up front. That's how socialism and slavery are alike. The question is, who does the work? And thank you to David Barton and Tim Barton for writing a book called The American Story, from which I got this idea, because I've known for a long time about socialism and about slavery, but how are they related? And David and Tim Barton made this fascinating observation about the development of the colonial times, between the difference between the Massachusetts colony in the north and the Virginia colony in the south. And they're making this fascinating observation that socialism and slavery are like in that you expect someone else to do your work for you. Okay, here's a quote from The American Story. Quote, with the Virginia colony's early rejection of the equality of all individuals, it became logical to preserve the sort of class distinctions common in England. At the top were white elites. Below this class were white citizens who owned small plots of land, followed by common laborers. At the bottom were free blacks and then slaves. The lower classes were expected to defer to their betters and groups, and labels became more important than individuals. End quote from David and Tim Barton, The American Story. See, that's fascinating because when you have it, what they had in the South, which was an aristocracy, you had classes of people. That leads to slavery. The same thing happens in socialism. I've been asking people for many years, am I the only one who had to read Animal Farm in high school? Well, I assume you did too. And so when you hear about socialist concepts being purported today, it should make you ask, didn't these people read Animal Farm? Well, the colonists had these two different ideas, and that's what David and Tim Barton are talking about. Let me quote them again. This difference between the equality of individuals in the Massachusetts colony and the aristocracy in the South, because it is this aristocracy that leads to this kind of slavery. Here we are again. Quote, the Pilgrims in the Massachusetts colony produced a very different legacy than the South. Citizens in these and other northern colonies found life no less challenging or dangerous than the southern colonists, and they too professed Christianity, just as those in Virginia had, but their thinking and behavior differed greatly. For one thing, they had a much greater personal knowledge of the Bible and its teachings. So while the Virginia colony was professedly Christian, the colonies in what became Massachusetts strove to be biblical, which made a significant difference in behavior as well as public policy. End quote, The American Story by David and Tim Barton. And so they're making this fascinating connection between socialism and slavery. If you have an aristocracy in the South, you expect others to do your work for you. That leads to slavery. Socialism has the same effect. Yeah. One last quote from The American Story. In 1646, are you getting that year? In 1646, so we're saying 130 years before the Declaration. In 1646, when a shipload of slaves arrived in Massachusetts, the colonists freed the slaves and imprisoned and punished the slave traders. 130 years before the Declaration. And so this draws me to the points that Sergei Seidamatov and I have made in the upcoming book, which will be out in just a few weeks now, called Biblical Economic Policies. And we state that there are 10 scriptural truths that help us understand how we're supposed to make economic policy. And this socialism and slavery idea, the idea that others should do your work for you, which is consistent in socialism and consistent in slavery, that we're going to look at these 10 points, or 10 biblical commandments of economics, as we call them. Well, the first one is people should be free. Well, in socialism and slavery, they're not free. I mean, we point to this famous painting by William Holman Hunt called The Light of the World, which is Jesus standing at the door and knocking. And the point is, there's no handle on Jesus' side of the door. that a human on the other side has to open it and accept it, right? Revelation 3:20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and sup with him and he with me, from the King James Version. And so that's why one of our concepts is work is good. But see, in slavery and in socialism, work is only good for the lower classes, not for the upper classes. The upper classes don't work, the lower classes do. So people should be free. I mean, so often I've stood in front of my classroom and crossed my arms over my chest and said, the intersection of economics and Christianity is freedom. Because see, in free market capitalist, because it's called free, get it? In free market capitalist economics, people are free, just as they are free in Christianity to accept or reject the invitation of Christ. And so I think that's one of the most important lessons we learn. Our second of the 10, I don't have time to get through all of them today, we might get through 7 of them, is work is good. And from Genesis 2:15, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. As a fellow Christian economist named Hugh Welchel says, God made something out of nothing. We are called to make something out of something. End quote from Hugh Welchel. That's what we're called to do. We are called to work. And we believe that work is good. From this, we get the Christian work ethic, right? The idea that Christians are supposed to work. But you can see that in slavery and in socialism, you have different classes. Some work, some do not work. And that's why we think that that is not a Christian economic idea, socialism nor slavery, obviously. The third one we talk about in our book is don't steal. Well, this is one of the 10 commandments. Exodus 20:15, you shall not steal. I mean, the idea that you don't steal, this assumes private property. Because if you didn't have private property, how could it be stolen? Right? So just in that one of those 10 commandments, don't steal. This assumes private ownership of property. All right, back to our point in this podcast. In socialism, there's not private ownership of property. In slavery, slaves are not able to own property. Matter of fact, they don't own their own labor. And so that's where these things come together. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Fourth one, don't covet. Don't covet. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant or female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor, says Exodus 20:17. Look, nearly every discussion about income inequality is a violation of the Old Testament 10th commandment, which says don't covet. This is what happens in socialism. This is what happens in slavery. This is how they are alike, for the fourth out of about 7 things I'll talk about today. In socialism and in slavery, you covet. You want something someone else has, and you take it away from them. You take it away their property. In socialism, the government takes private property, and so no private property is owned. In slavery, slaves are not able to own property, and they're not able to own their own labor. Why? Because of covetousness. 5, use honest measures. Deuteronomy 25:13-16 says, you shall not have in your bag differing weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house differing measures, a large and a small. You shall have a full and just weight. You shall have a full and just measure, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you, says Deuteronomy 25. We go on to say in our book, Biblical Economic Policies, but there are 11 verses about honest measures in the Old Testament. This is just one of them. And so when we say honest measures, socialism is not an honest measure because it assumes different levels of taxation for the rich and the poor. You may be so accustomed to that you just assume that that's correct, but it's not. People are treated differently in socialism. It says, and that's sort of the big lie about socialism. It says that people will be equal. They will not be equal. Some will work and some will not work, which is our theme today. And so there's different levels of taxation, which, again, you may just assume. Here's the deal. Socialists are really good at demand. They're terrible at supply. Just for 30 seconds, please, about healthcare, right? They say healthcare should be more widely distributed. Well, that's about demand. When you ask them, how are you going to supply this? there's not an answer. Because they're good at saying this is how demand works, but they're terrible at answering, well, then how are you going to supply this? Okay, I said 30 seconds, so now I got to get back to my subject, right? And so these idea that we have different levels, that there's not honest measures. Slavery is not an honest measure. Socialism is not an honest measure because supply can't meet demand. Yeah. Trade is good. Point number 6 out of 7 today. And this is from Biblical Economic Policies by Arnott and Seydamatov. Trade is good. You know, if you look back at one of my podcasts, it was actually the second one I did. Podcast number 2 is called The Prophet Who Made a Profit. And the point I make in that one is that Jesus was in the furniture business with his dad for probably 15 years before he started his ministry. So he was trading. He was making either buildings or furniture or something which he sold on the open market. Jesus was a prophet who made a profit. Shouldn't we do the same? Shouldn't we trade? Shouldn't we own goods and trade them freely? Well, I've just defined free market capitalism. But in socialism, there's no trading of goods. In slavery, there's no trading of goods. See, that's how they're similar. See, here's a good quote from a guy named Sam Gregg. He's written a couple of really good books, works for the Acton Institute. He says, from the beginning of the first forms of capitalism in northern Italy, Flanders, and other parts of medieval Europe from the 11th century onward, many of the merchants involved in increasingly sophisticated forms of finance wrote inscriptions such as Deus enim et proficum. I probably mispronounced that. That is Latin for the title of Sam Gregg's book from which this is excerpted, called For God and Profit. For God and Profit. Trade is good. But in slavery, there's no trade. And in socialism, there's no trade. There's no trade in slavery because people own the slaves and own their labor. There's no trade in socialism because the government owns everything. I mean, have you really thought about it? If there really was a purely socialist economy, and there's not, all economies are across a spectrum from free market capitalism to socialism. It's across a spectrum, right? But if there was a fully socialist economy, there'd be no need for money. You've heard this phrase, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Why would you need money? Everything you need, according to the government, would be supplied by you, would be supplied by the government, So why would you make any decisions? There would be no need for money. I mean, think about it. So this Texas Rangers may still play baseball. And if some government entity determined that me and my grandson deserved a ticket, they'd give us one. Well, do you realize? Under socialism, there'd be no need for money because the government would give you everything you need. Think about the word need. Who determines need in that situation, right? So that's how socialism and slavery are alike. Slaves never had money. Why would they need money? Everything was provided for them, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's how socialism and slavery are alike. I've got to work on this quote from Jay Richards, who I think is just one of the smartest Christian economists I've ever read. And I'm on point number 7 of the 10 Commandments of Biblical Economics from Biblical Economic Principles by Arnott and Seydamatov. This number 7 is love your neighbor as yourself. And it comes directly from Matthew 22:39. And in the classroom, we talk about consumer surplus and supplier surplus, where both get richer at the same time. I don't have time to dig into that today. Here's Richards in his book, Money, Greed, and God, quote, "The market is, as Friedrich Hayek said, probably the most complex structure in the universe. It deserves our admiration, and yet very few critics have fully understood it. Fewer still have thought of it as a stunning example of God's providence over a fallen world. It is just what we might expect of a God, who even in a fallen world can still work all things together for good." End quote. Jay Richards, Money, Greed, and God. That is one of the best statements for free market capitalism I've ever heard. And in this book, I then make the comment, look, what's best for your neighbors is also best for you in a free market because of producer and consumer surplus. Both of those exist in a free market capitalist economy. They do not exist in socialism. They do not exist in slavery. That's how socialism and slavery are alike. Why? Because somebody does the work for you. And that's why they're both non-biblical ideas. I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist, where our slogan is, fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time.